Yeah, Juliet, go for it.
I work for SSRP and we've got another few events today and tomorrow. So yeah, obviously Beth's seminar and then the allergy and health one that Alan just explained. And then this evening there's like a networking event in the Sussex Humanities Lab. So if you're interested in connection with arts and sustainability, that. And then our final session is tomorrow on sustainability and conflict studies.
Sorry, Beth.
No, it's fine. No, I didn't. I wasn't being passive aggressive. I just thought it helped to have the information. Oh, yes, they can hear, so that's good. Shall I start?
Yeah, you can start.
Oh, can someone at the back maybe turn the lights off? It might make it, as long as your promise not to fall asleep.
Well, that's why we come down.
Oh. So hi everyone, my name's Dr Beth Nicholls. I think I know quite a few of you. So I'm going to be talking today, I'm a research fellow in the School of Life Sciences in EBE, and I'm going to be talking to you today about some urban farming work that I did as part of an SSRP funded project, and that's continuing on now. And as we've just talked about, SSRP is a research programme, the Sussex Sustainability Research Programme, that aims to bring together life scientists and social scientists to work towards these sustainable development goals and to do research together that helps us kind of reach some of these targets towards sustainable development. And you already know now that there are lots of kind of events ongoing this week, of which this is one. But because this is part of the master's programme, there's loads of seats at the front, don't worry. Because this is part of the master's programme as well, I was asked just to talk a little bit about my kind of research journey as well and how I got to be here. So I started on an ecology degree at the University of Wales in Bangor, which is an absolutely beautiful place to study ecology. And then after a brief year of teaching 8-year-olds how to cave and climb and fence, I then moved to the University of Exeter, which is where I did my master's and my PhD in animal behaviour. And this was really kind of blue skies research, so looking at regulation of foraging roles in honeybee and bumblebee colonies, but also looking at how bees choose which flowers to visit. And I guess my main advice for any of you who are thinking about doing a PhD later on is to think really carefully, not just about the question, but about the methods that you'll be using your PhD. So if you're a field person, definitely think about whether that work's going to involve lots of lab work or vice versa. And also think about kind of the research environment as well. So are there lots of other PhD students in the department? Is that important to you, or do you not worry so much about that? How hands-on or not do you want your PhD supervisor to be? So lots of things to think about besides just the question or the study organism. And then after my PhD, I wasn't quite sure whether I wanted to stay in academia or whether I wanted to work more in public engagement and outreach. But I ended up going to Rothamsted Research, which is one of the oldest agricultural universities or research centres, to do some really cool work with radar and tracking bee behaviour. So after my PhD, I was really keen to do some work that kind of applied my knowledge of insect behaviour to more applied questions such as pathogens or pesticides. So I was really fortunate to do this job, and this kind of blue line here is an individual bee that's learning the location of its nest, and we put this little transponder on the bee and track their behaviour. And so that was really enjoyable, and I also spent some time in Germany as well, learning molecular techniques for detecting diseases. And then I came to Sussex, and I've kind of never left, or have sort of left, but then came back again. And that was to work with Professor Dave Gawson, looking at pesticide residues in bumblebee and honeybee colonies, and looking at their effects on behaviour. And then I started the project that I'm going to tell you about today, again with Professor Dave Gawson, looking at urban farming. And towards the end of that project, I applied for a fellowship, and I didn't get it. And then I applied for another fellowship. But this whole process of applying for your own independent funding can take a long time. And so it takes about a year from kind of applying to getting an award if you get it. So in that time, I went and did something completely different. So this is me cutting down some invasive pine trees on a heathland. So I went to work for the National Park in an outreach and public engagement role. So totally different. I really enjoyed it, but I did really miss the kind of creativity and freedom that you get in an academic role. And in conservation, as I'm sure many of you are painfully aware, the job security is not much better than in academia. So I was fortunate enough, I got the fellowship and then I came back, and that's allowed me to kind of start my own research group here. And I've kind of gone full circle. So now I'm working again on kind of foraging decisions and how bees decide where to collect pollen and nectar from. But I'm hoping to use that to answer some applied questions as well. So looking at how we can design agri-environment schemes to better support kind of bees' nutritional needs, but also pollination of food crops as well. So that's a real kind of whirlwind of kind of how I got to where I am today. And I'm very happy to talk to the master's students about any of those different roles that I've done and what I enjoyed, or any kind of advice or things not to do, probably more than anything. But today I'm going to talk to you about urban farming, specifically right here in Brighton Hove. And so, as I'm sure many of you are aware, you know, our global population is growing, and it is a challenge how we can feed our population sustainably. So conventional farming methods are pretty environmentally damaging. They involve clearance of land that could otherwise be supporting biodiversity, but they also involve the use of pesticides and fertilizers, which not only kind of pollute the habitats that they're applied to, are also kind of incredibly energetically costly to produce. So they're producing greenhouse gases as well. And so this leads to the question about, you know, how are we going to feed more people, but without clearing more land, without causing further damage, without meaning that we can't feed those populations in the future? Because in some areas of the world, there are real concerns that there might be only, you know, 100 years worth of harvest left in that soil, which is not ideal. And sort of alongside this growth in human populations, there's also mass migration as well. So around the world, people are moving away from rural areas where food has traditionally been grown to urban areas and cities. And the UN estimates that by 2050, about 2/3 of us will be living in a city or kind of urban conurbation. And so lots of people have raised the question of whether it wouldn't be more sustainable to kind of move the field closer to the plate, as it were, so to start producing food closer to where people are living and in land that has kind of already been cleared for some reason or another. And this is happening around the world, so it's not a new concept. It's estimated that about 6% of farmland around the world is urban. And some people estimate that it might be providing up to 20% of the world's food. But typically urban farms are very small scale. They can be quite ad hoc. They might be occurring on land that it's not quite clear who owns that land or whether people have the kind of legal rights to farm that land. And so unlike conventional farming where you know, governments tend to collect detailed data on crop yields and pesticide use, for urban farming, that data just isn't really available. So this is a farm in Calcutta in India that's kind of built on the site of an old landfill, and the soil is very productive, but there are lots of concerns around kind of additional contamination in that soil where people are growing food. So two big questions really are, you know, can farming on this small scale where you can't bring in a combine harvester or a tractor, you know, really be productive? And also, what are the risks from, I put pesticide use here, but really contamination of the soil as well. Similarly, we know from a lot of the crops that are grown, at least in temperate crop systems, what the pollinators are, who pollinates which crop, but we don't know whether those pollinators are found in urban areas where we might want to grow similar crops, or whether populations in urban areas are large enough or diverse enough to support that food production. So that's kind of another question that we have, and often I get asked, you know, can't we just use honeybees or bumblebees? Well, no, because different crops have different flower morphologies and they require kind of a diversity of pollinators, and that's been quite well established now. So we need to check if we're going to kind of advocate for growing more food in cities, whether we have the pollinators to kind of support that as well. And so, as I said, this initial project was funded by the Sussex Sustainability Research Programme, and it was led by Dave Goulson, but it also brought together people from all different departments across the university, so life scientists, social scientists, geographers, and also we collaborated with Parthiv Basu at the University of Calcutta as well, but I'll just be talking about the kind of UK work that we did today. And so one of the first things that we looked at, and that was kind of within the remit of the first phase of SSRP was to look at where there might be synergies and trade-offs between achieving these goals. So for anyone not familiar, these are 17 goals with specific objectives and targets that have been agreed to by the UN nations that we're all supposed to be working towards to achieve. So our project was looking at, in the context of urban agriculture, where might be some of the synergies, so places where we could achieve kind of a double win, and where might be some of the trade-offs. So, you know, it's a no-brainer that producing food in cities should improve people's access to fresh food. You know, in places where people are going to then sell that food, it can also create jobs. And in theory, it should be reducing the food miles, so that kind of carbon cost associated with that food, and increasing access to green spaces in our cities. And as well as kind of improving nutrition, we also have quite good evidence that kind of growing your own food and spending time in green spaces and nature also is good for general well-being as well, so mental health and that kind of thing, and building community. Of course, having more green spaces in our city can help with climate mitigation as well, so reducing kind of heat islands and providing better flood defences than kind of concrete or paving slabs. And in theory, it can also boost biodiversity as well in our cities, and, you know, potentially reduce pressure on areas that might otherwise be cleared for growing crops. But of course, as I said, there are some trade-offs there as well. So land in cities is very precious. It's under lots of pressure from lots of different kind of types of infrastructure. And even, you know, just within Brighton, there's constantly kind of threats of development of lots of those key kind of growing sites where we know they're supporting really good biodiversity. So that's why it's important to kind of get more data on these kind of ecosystems. I've already mentioned the risk of exposure to contaminants, but also there's concerns about, you know, what water is being used to irrigate the crops and how it's being disposed of, particularly if pesticide use is high in these systems, which we don't really have data for. So we then went on, after kind of assessing, you know, looking in the literature for what kind of limited data there was, to conduct a case study in Brighton and Hove. And that's not just because we live in Brighton, but Brighton is actually a really good place to study food systems. So it was the first city in the UK to have a food strategy, which was developed by the Brighton and Hove Food Partnership, which do a lot of work around kind of nutrition, but also kind of community access to food as well. And, you know, it has this reputation of being a very affluent, kind of bougie place to live, but there's a lot of inequities and poverty in Brighton. And, you know, 8% of residents are struggling to meet daily food needs. This is an older statistic. I'm sure it's gone up now with the cost of living crisis. And our local NHS trust is spending around £80 million per year on food-related diseases. So it's kind of pertinent to understand whether growing food in the city might help to alleviate some of these pressures potentially. We chose to use a citizen science approach, as the title kind of suggests. And so citizen science, for anyone that's not familiar, is where you work with growers or you work with people who are not trained scientists, so growers in our case, to collect data. That might be data that they're particularly interested and invested in. So in the case of our growers, they wanted to know kind of more about pollinators and their crop yields, or it might be something like a passive kind of online project where they're just helping out scientists by kind of looking at protein structure or counting penguins. There's all kinds of different citizen science projects that you might have come across. And one of the main reasons is that in the UK, but also abroad as well, as I mentioned, these areas of land tend to be quite ad hoc. In Brighton, at least, allotments are all behind lock and key. It's actually really hard. I really struggled to get access to some allotment sites. People have concerns about kind of vandalism and people literally stealing produce from their sites. And we also wanted, in the second year of the study, to try and quantify production in people's gardens as well. And of course, it would be quite tricky to go around and sample lots and lots of people's private gardens to try and estimate food production and pollination visits. But it's also a really good tool for engaging with people as well, and kind of raising awareness of these kind of issues. But of course, it does come with kind of some drawbacks around, you know, how accurate can the data or how complex can the kind of study B that you want to do. So there is a bit of a balance there. And so we asked citizen scientists to kind of help contribute to 3 main questions. So as I mentioned, there's not much data on how productive small-scale urban farms are. So we asked them to weigh the produce that they harvested just from their insect-pollinated crops. So flowering crops that we know are dependent on insects. And I'll go through that in a second, but we gave them kind of lists so that they would know. We also asked them to keep a diary of pest control habits. So when they noticed damage on a particular crop, what action did they take? What kind of pest did they think was causing the damage? If they did nothing, that was also fine. They could record that as well. And then we also wanted to look at kind of plant-insect interactions as pollination ecologists. So we asked them to do very simple kind of snapshot counts of which insects are visiting which flowering crops. So they did that kind of once or twice a month. And the idea was that it should be quite quick for them to collect that data and a real snapshot view of who was visiting. And we provided training for them. So we went to lots of allotments and kind of held an event and provided training and how to collect the data. So this is an example of kind of very simplified data collection sheet where they would write the crop and estimate the number of flowers and then just tally up how many of these different pollinator types. So as I said, it was pretty crude because we had to keep the methods fairly simple for non-experts to be able to identify. We also gave them some kind of ID guides as well. And we had kind of an online forum and that kind of thing where people could ask questions as well. And then I also got permission from several allotment holders to go and do my own surveys as well. So the aim really was to kind of develop a method that maybe we could roll out in other contexts, so with our partners in India as well. So I wanted obviously to kind of verify that data, and you know, when we do citizen science, it's always good to have that extra kind of verification step and check that the data that's being collected is really kind of truly representative. So I selected sites kind of right across the city. And in terms of participation, anyone that's done a citizen science project will know that dropout is often really, really high. So you get initial real enthusiasm for the project. Lots of people signed up. So I had over 150 people signed up, but actually only about 34 people submitted data. Those people that did submit data were very consistent. So that was really good. So we had kind of full data sets from their plots. But I will talk a little bit at the end about kind of some of the reasons that people gave for dropping out. And what was really nice with such a local project is that we could hold kind of in-person events where we asked lots of questions, asked people to kind of give us feedback. And we were able to implement some of those changes between the first and second year of the study. And that led to kind of 2/3 increase in the number of people submitting data. And overall, we had about 1,200 records submitted in total. But anyone that came to Janine's kind of Viva talk, she is the expert, one of my PhD students. She is really good at getting high retention. So also need to speak to her about what her kind of magical tips are for keeping people engaged. She's amazing. So in terms of productivity, people were growing on around 175 meters squared. So that's basically the size of a kind of standard allotment plot, but some people had kind of double plots or triple plots, and some people were growing on as small as kind of a 1 meter square balcony. And they were harvesting around 70 kilograms of food per season. But it's really important to note that that's just, the bottom line and all my paper references are cut off, sorry, but I can share the slides. That is just insect pollinated crops. So it's a massive underestimate probably, because we didn't ask people to record how many potatoes they were harvesting, root vegetables, actually quite a lot of heavy crops that don't rely on insects, because we wanted to make this part, you know, as manageable as possible for people. But, you know, some people are harvesting up to about 250 kilos. And on average, the yield, again, just of insect pollinated crops was about 1 kilo per meter square. And that holds up with some other kind of studies of small scale farming systems and urban farming systems. But, you know, some people were harvesting up to 10 kilos per meter square. And so we wanted to use that data to kind of compare to conventional farming yields. But it is a bit tricky because it's quite an unusual farming system. So most fruit and veg crops in the UK are grown under glass or grown in polytunnels, so under quite different systems. But just a crude look, we can see kind of the yields of bean, wheat, oilseed rape, and the yields that some of the farmers were getting are kind of certainly within those ranges, but it's quite hard to make direct comparisons of horticulture, so vegetables and fruits. A similar study in Australia, so comparing kind of commercial rural farms with urban farms, also found them to be much more kind of productive, so twice the yield. But they also looked at inputs in the broadest sense, so labour costs, which we didn't quantify at all, which is quite a limitation, but also kind of energetic costs in terms of did people drive to the site, how much fertilizer did they use, how much water did they use. So this is a really great study, and they found that in terms of land use, urban farms are really efficient because often they're kind of intercropped. So you might have lettuces overplanted with a taller crop, for example. But they found that at present kind of material and labour use was pretty inefficient. And so they suggest that, as long as you are cautious about those other inputs, then it is possible to make urban farming sustainable, but you need to think about all of those kind of inputs as well. And although we didn't quantify labour costs, I would say that some of that labour, at least in the UK context of kind of home growers in allotments and gardens, that labour might also be having benefits for the individual growers in terms of health and well-being, as we've already talked about. So there's been some quite interesting studies showing kind of improved connectiveness to nature, better feelings of community, kind of particularly for older or more lonely residents, and also direct evidence that allotment holders compared to kind of an age-matched, kind of demographic matched sample tend to be healthier and more physically active. So there are some benefits of those labour costs as well. And then a PhD student working with Dave Linder, who some of you might remember, she also made this pretty cool widget called the Garden Shop Calculator, and that we wanted to make into an app, but was very complicated. So it stayed as a kind of Google Sheets form. But this would allow people to put in the weight of their harvests, and then it would tell them, based on Waitrose organic prices, how much their food would cost if they went and bought it at the shop. Again, ignoring any of the kind of labour costs, just looking at kind of putting a value on that produce. But the other thing that it did is, based on kind of how dependent on pollination those particular crops are, it would calculate kind of how much of that harvest was owed to pollinators. So we can have a big debate about, putting value on ecosystem services and value on nature. I think it can be quite controversial. Lots of people don't like it, but it was quite an interesting tool for the growers and for engagement, for them to see kind of how much of that produce was directly thanks to pollinators. And again, you can try it yourself if you go to the Buzz Club webpage. You can have a go, download it if you grow your own food, see how much your produce is worth. And so people were harvesting about £550 worth of food on average, some people up to £2,500, and again, that's just their insect pollinated crops. And on average, about £300 or so worth of that was owed to pollinators each season. And those crops with the highest pollinator price were things like soft fruit and berries, which you probably know are pretty expensive to buy in the shops and are also often imported from very far away, but also fairly topical pumpkins as well. And, I had lots of kind of informal chats with growers in the allotments who were saying that they often kind of chose to grow those crops that they did know were higher prices, or perhaps grow crops that they might struggle to get at a supermarket. So certain kind of heritage types of berries and fruit that they can't just buy at their local supermarket. And then with my data, and I've also done this with the citizen science data as well, I then was able to kind of construct these plant pollinator bipartite networks. So this basically tells you, who's interacting with who, so which insects are visiting which crops. You'll notice, so the size of the bar tells you kind of the number of visits, so how frequently that insect was observed. And you'll notice that the bars for the crops are all the same sizes. That's because I didn't really have much of a control over sampling effort because I was doing things on a kind of per plot basis, so I couldn't tell the growers what to grow. So in this case, I kind of divided the number of visits by the insects by the total number of visits to that crop to kind of try to standardize that. Obviously, I don't know about anyone else, this gives me a bit of a migraine when I'm looking at it. So I don't know if this is going to work, but oh, this is the moment of truth. Will it do it? So R has a way of making dynamic plots. They're called D3, so dynamic data-driven diagrams, I think. And this allows us to kind of look. Oh, do I need to do it on that one?
No.
Is it working?
It should be on the computer. But now it's working.
Oof. Okay. Is that?
Don't check the mouse on the
No, it is. Oh.
It's on the screen, but it's not. It's confusing.
I can't see my. So it's obviously doing something. Don't try and do anything novel. Is this working now? Or what's happening now?
Yeah.
So this allows you to kind of, the static network gives lots and lots of kind of network metrics, but obviously they're not so great for kind of presenting and a bit meaningless kind of in isolation. So hopefully you can see that bumblebees were kind of the most frequently observed pollinators. I also broke that data down by species, but that's not so comparable with the citizen science data. And honeybees also very commonly visited. And were visiting a very wide range of crops. So they were kind of very generalists, which we know from data in rural environments as well. Somewhat surprising were the high number of beetles that we observed, but this was actually driven by the small, tiny black pollen beetles that we see visiting squash and cucumber flowers. They can pollinate, but they're traditionally thought of as a pest, and actually a lot of the neonicotinoid pesticides that are used against pollen beetles. So it'd be really interesting to know over these smaller kind of distances within an urban growing space whether they're actually providing some pollination service or not. Hoverflies were pretty generalist as well, but something that really surprised me was the high proportion of visits to cherry flowers. So in commercial orchards where people are growing apples and soft fruit, they tend to use honeybee colonies or bumblebee kind of imported colonies. But I think the scientific and pollination world are starting to kind of really appreciate the value of hoverflies as pollinators. And again, it would be really interesting. I need to dive into the literature a little bit more to see kind of, is this a urban specific phenomenon, or are they also providing quite a lot of the pollination service in commercial orchards as well? And then flies, again, they were slightly more specialist, but they're really important pollinators of strawberries. So we didn't really see any bees visiting strawberry flowers. So flies are definitely kind of important pollinators. And again, we might need to think about kind of not just bees when we're thinking about creating habitat for pollinators in our urban areas. Oh, sorry. Oh, I love technology. And so in terms of the crops that were most popular, if you don't kind of standardize, it was really the flowering trees and shrubs. So they had the lowest specialization, so they were visited by the broadest range of pollinators. That makes sense. Most of them have these very accessible flowers, so open flowers that lots of different insects, regardless of kind of tongue length, can visit. And they also have, at least in the case of kind of blackberries or bramble, which is often quite a controversial plant, particularly on allotments where you have like weed notices if you've got too much uncultivated ground. So they were providing a lot of food. And so this is something that we'd like to look at in future research, thinking about perennial crops, so things that grow year after year. They have lots of other benefits in terms of that labour input and kind of fuel and all of those other things, because you're not ripping them up and planting them every year. So they might be quite a good sustainable option. And, you know, there's other work that has also shown kind of biodiversity benefits of allotments. So this is a really cool study by Kath Baldock. And she looked at 4 different cities across the UK and kind of quantified pollinator abundance in all these different habitat types. And you can see that allotments were actually kind of #1 for bee abundance, better even than kind of some of these citywide nature reserves. And so their kind of modelling suggests that, you know, the biggest gains for pollinators could be made by increasing the area of allotments in cities. Also cemetery is really good, but I'm not quite sure whether that's a positive thing or whether we want to be increasing the areas of cemeteries. But yeah, that's just some more evidence looking at benefits for biodiversity. And then in terms of comparing to the citizen scientist data, so what was really striking at first is that even though the citizen scientists probably did about half as many crop observations as me, they had almost, well, a very high number of interactions, which is quite surprising. And what I think might be going on there is that in some of the kind of feedback sessions, you know, sometimes the crops, they just don't have very many insects visiting them. When I'm doing observations of lots of plots, it's fine because I can kind of see that overall view. But if you're just surveying your plot and doing a 1-month snapshot and you don't see very many insects during that survey, it can be really demotivating because you're not thinking about the kind of bigger data set. And so what I suspect might be going on is that people are kind of spending a bit more time and waiting for kind of some insects to visit. But if we kind of standardize the data in terms of the proportion of observations, in theory, it shouldn't make such a difference. But even if we kind of match the sites, so just reduce the number of sites to be, you know, the same habitats that I was surveying, you still see very high number of observations, much higher than me. And that doesn't seem to be to do with kind of a vast difference in the kind of crops that are being surveyed. So the general proportions between my data and the data that citizen scientists collected are pretty similar. So it's not like they would just happen to be surveying lots more very pollinator attractive crops, for example. And so then looking at the networks, again, it's a bit hard to pick out this information, but hopefully you can see that there's lots more reporting of flies interacting, and overall each of the kind of crop visitors, so the pollinators in the citizen scientist data, tended to visit or recorded visiting a wider range of crops. So the citizen science data is, the network is a lot less specialised, the interactions are more evenly distributed across the different pollinators, and the pollinators are visiting more crops than in my data, so they have higher generality. And so also when we look kind of at a pollinator group, what really surprised me was kind of the underreporting by the citizen scientists in white of bumblebees and honeybees. So bumblebees are really charismatic bees. You know, if you ask someone to draw a bee, they'll probably draw a bumblebee. So I thought, if anything, that we would get over kind of reporting of that species. But flies were kind of massively over-reported compared to my data, which is also pretty interesting. So I can't exactly pinpoint why it is. I have a few ideas. I mean, it might also be that perhaps they were taking their observations at different times of day as well. So I also have that data. So I'm still kind of digging into the differences and trying to come to some conclusions about whether the citizen scientist data is kind of good enough to give us a kind of broad overview, particularly in such an understudied environment, or whether it would be better kind of to invest in professional scientists collecting that data. So that's kind of ongoing at the moment. And then a last kind of experiment that I'll just talk about is one that I ran myself to really try and provide experimental evidence as to whether crops grown in urban areas are pollinator limited or not. So are they receiving enough visits from pollinators? In about 30 plots across the city, I placed kind of paired samples of strawberry plants, and one plant was just sort of left alone and visited by pollinators that existed in the environment. And then the other plant got kind of a helping hand from me, so some supplemental pollination. And so if there are enough pollinators, this plant shouldn't be limited. It should get enough visits to kind of produce identical yields, very nice looking strawberries. There shouldn't be a difference. But if there are not enough pollinators, then we might expect the plants that are getting extra pollen from me to produce higher yields, or for the strawberries to be of kind of better quality. Because if plants don't get kind of effective pollination, then they can end up kind of misshapen or not growing properly. And that's particularly evident in strawberries. And we chose strawberries because, you know, we saw that they weren't particularly kind of attractive to our conventional pollinators, but were definitely being visited by flies. And so it was a nice finding to see that we didn't really have any differences in the total yield and the berry weight or sugar content or water content of the strawberries. So the yields were similar between the two treatments. But when it came to kind of the quality of pollination that they received, so as I just mentioned, you know, each one of these needs to be fertilized, the pistils, to produce a nice kind of evenly shaped and swelled berry. And if they're not all coated in pollen, then you get these kind of misshaped berries. And so the proportion of these that were fertilized was significantly higher in the supplemental treatment. So that suggests that, you know, the open pollinated plants were kind of potentially missing out on very high quality pollination. And then we used kind of a classification system similar to that's used in kind of supermarkets. So class 4 and class 3 are probably not going to be sold in your supermarket, or maybe now sold as wonky berries, which some supermarkets have been doing. And so the supplemental pollination treatment did have kind of a higher proportion of these class 1 and class 2. But, you know, for people who are growing their own food and their own strawberries, I think they're going to love each class the same and not care so much. But if we want to advocate for kind of growing food commercially in urban areas, we might want to think again about providing habitat for hoverflies and flies. And I know that Ellie Rotheray, who some of you know, has done a little bit of work around that, about providing breeding habitat for hoverflies and looking at kind of similar measures of pollination. And then finally, in terms of pesticide use, these results were pretty good, or like pretty pleasing, in the sense that not many people, at least in my study, were using pesticides. The main exception was slug pellets. And again, if you try to grow food in Brighton, you'll know that slugs are a big issue. And so lots of people were using slug pellets, organic or non-organic. And, you know, that can still have massive implications for kind of trophic, higher trophic levels, like hedgehogs or birds that might be eating those slugs. And I guess it's important to say that, you know, we were asking people to take part in a study in Brighton, which is a fairly environmentally conscious town, but also, you know, we were kind of hooking them in with learning about pollinators and that kind of thing. So again, we might have a kind of bias towards more environmentally friendly participants potentially. So it'd be really interesting to study this across kind of a broader geographical range, for example, and in different kind of settings. But just some news, so the RHS, the Royal Horticultural Society, has always been pretty pro-pesticide, or certainly didn't come out kind of against any of the controversy around neonicotinoids, but they have now longer classed slugs and snails are no longer pests, and they're advocating for kind of living in harmony with these pests, which could make a big difference when a lot of gardeners, you know, are getting their advice from the RHS and their website. So in terms of conclusions, I think we've shown that urban farming can be pretty productive, but, you know, we weren't quantifying labour costs and all of those other costs, so it's important to factor those in. And it does seem like, compared to conventional farming, the pesticide risk is pretty low, at least in the context that we were studying. Some of the work that we were doing in India was not the case. There was lots of pesticide use there, and there were quite concerns around kind of risks for human health as well. And there are lots of other benefits of urban agriculture as well to cities, and I think there are opportunities to kind of work towards several of the sustainable development goals through urban farming. So this work is kind of continuing through the Food Systems Centre for Doctoral Training. So I have a PhD student, Leah Sam, who I'm co-supervising with someone at Greenwich. And so she has a nutrition background and she's a social scientist. So she's going to be looking at kind of synergies and trade-offs between dietary needs, sustainability, and also kind of how people access that food, and looking at that in the context of the cost of living crisis specifically, because we really suspect that, the value of that food that we kind of calculated could well be going up, and the kind of benefits of growing your own food when food at the supermarket is becoming so expensive might be changing. And so just wanted to flag the Food Systems Centre for Doctoral Training. So if any of the master's students are interested in food systems and potentially doing a PhD in this area, they'll be recruiting for the 3rd cohort next year. And I also have a project available through Sucker Bio, which is the South Coast DTP, so another doctoral training programme. And so you kind of apply to the central programme, and then you select projects afterwards. So do check that out. It's on my Twitter as well, or give me an email about it. And then finally, I just wanted to talk briefly, do I have time? I'm in time, yeah. About kind of some of the lessons learned, because I presented this work at a conference before and people were really interested in kind of what would be the lessons learned about what to do or not to do in citizen science. So as I say, my kind of levels of data submitted were pretty abysmal. And the feedback though from these kind of events that we held kind of between the 2 years of the study and at the end were really important. And if you are going to run a citizen science project, I really recommend kind of doing a pilot study first and getting an advisory board or a kind of cohort of people who are going to take part in the study, who can give you kind of advice and input about, what's realistic to ask people to do time-wise, what do you think would motivate you, what would demotivate you. And so in the first year, our training wasn't that hands-on. I kind of gave a presentation like this, like classic academic, didn't think about the fact that I could, go to people's allotments and talk to them there. And I think that made a massive difference, demonstrating the techniques in the field rather than just talking to people like this. One really interesting thing is that people had massive concerns about how accurate the data was. So I had asked people to estimate, roughly how many plants do you have and how many flowers, what proportion of those flowers are open. And in science, we do that a lot. You can't count every single flower, so we'll just sample like a small section, right, and kind of multiply up. But people were trying to count every single flower, or if they couldn't, they thought, oh, the data would be useless to us. So I think it was really important to communicate why we're sampling things in a certain way and how that scientific process works. So that was something that really demotivated people because they felt like their data wasn't good enough for the study. So I think communicating that. And I was giving people updates every now and then, but people tended to wait to the end of the season to submit data. So then I was trying to kind of analyse some of my data so I had stuff to tell people about, so that they could get that global view of the data set when they might not be seeing lots of insects themselves. They really hated going onto their computer and putting the data in, which is fair enough. The reason you go to your allotment is to spend time in nature, away from your desk, away from your computer. So we gave them lots of options to just take photos of the data sheets and send them to me, or to post their books back at the end of the year with, pay for postage. And so that made it easier to get the data, because often people were filling in all the surveys, but then the data sheets were just going mouldy in a greenhouse. So actually getting the data back from people was a bit challenging as well. And as I said, not getting any insect visits can be a bit demotivating. So maybe when you're designing a citizen science study, you want to put something in that kind of gives that kind of bit of morale boost, even if it's not necessarily the data that you're super interested in, for example. And as I say, implementing those kind of, that feedback did massively increase the submission rates. And as I say, I think having pilot studies and co-creating with the people that you want to work with is important. And overall, kind of the benefits meant that we could survey a massive spatial scale. And if we rolled this out kind of across the country, you know, it'd be very hard for me to go and survey all of those different allotments and take into account kind of different cultural practices and different areas. And it was a great tool for engagement, and we did get a lot of feedback from growers about not just pollinators, but learning more about other beneficial insects involved in pest control, for example, that previously, for example, hobblefly larvae, they had been killing because they thought were mosquitoes. So it's a really good tool to engage people that way. But as I say, there's a massive challenge in terms of the accuracy of the data. So I need to dig into that more with the new manuscript that I'm writing. And I do suspect that we had quite a pro-environmental bias. So the pesticide use might be a slight underestimate. But yeah, thanks very much for listening. And obviously thanks to all the citizen scientists and my collaborators and students that have worked on the project, and SSRP for funding the project. Okay, yeah, sure. Any questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Beth.
No worries.
Great work.
Thank you.
When you were supplementary pollinating the strawberries, what technique did you use?
So I had like kind of donor plants at the university, and I would take pollen from several different plants and then kind of load up paintbrushes and then take them to the allotment, and kept them in kind of tubes with silica to stop the pollen drying out.
Oh, okay. And
Yeah, I can show you.
that would be helpful. And was it the same species or cultivar? Sorry.
Yeah, the same cultivar. I forgot. I think it was all El Santa. They produce horrible, not very nice tasting strawberries in my experience, but they're very commonly grown one commercially and people growing them in their gardens.
And I have a second question.
Okay.
It was good that you were comparing conventional and urban farming. Do you think to sort of further your cost benefit analysis, you could look into the next time, maybe look into the input costs in terms of the time and the equipment that perhaps the growers are buying to see whether the inputs are less than sort of the value of the fruit that they're producing, and then compare that to commercial farming.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. So there is a group at Sheffield led by Jill Edmonton, and they did a similar kind of diary approach, but they were asking people to record kind of everything, like how much time did they spend there, you know, how did they feel about spending time there, but also I've not thought about kind of that initial investment in kind of equipment and things. So yeah.
Yeah, and I could understand that growers would be starting from a different place in terms of they might have things installed in different size gardens, and it might be difficult to value that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it's an interesting question.
Next step.
Yeah, we can talk more about it as well. Oh, there was a question just behind you, and then
I was wondering, you said that you wanted to do pollinating insects, but the beetles, you said you didn't think were actually pollinators.
So pollen beetles can pollinate, but they tend to only travel very short distances. So they might do a bit of self-pollination within the flower, but things like squash and cucumber generally need cross-pollination. They have kind of male and female flowers. So in conventional farms, it's often kind of reported that they're not traveling enough between flowers to be effective pollinators, but maybe the way that people grow in urban settings where their plants are much closer together, for example, or kind of often people will grow vertically as well. I don't know, maybe the beetles might be more effective pollinators, but they're typically thought of as pests.
Because they were such a large amount of like the data set, wouldn't you want to see if they were effective pollinators before you do them?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So in the paper that I've written, I've talked about flower visitors, and that is actually something that I normally put in and I didn't put in. I'm just looking at visitation, so I can't really say anything about pollination. So yeah, it's a really good point, and normally I make that caveat right at the beginning. But no, it's thank you for bringing it up. So yeah, I'm talking about visitation. So yeah, I did have a JRA student who was doing kind of single visit pollination efficiency. So we would bag flowers before they open, then take the flowers off, then let one insect visit of those different types and look at how effective they were at depositing pollen. It was tedious for him and one of those really hot summers, and yeah, we didn't get a lot of data, but that would be really nice to kind of really show which were effective pollinators, not just who's visiting. So yeah, very good point. Yeah.
Thank you. I was interested in what feedback you had from your system participants in terms of recruitment, training, and their whole experience.
Yeah, so I guess I tried to kind of summarize some of the things that they said about kind of what put them off from submitting data or carrying on. But there was a lot of positives as well, as I say, around people kind of, you know, not knowing that anything other than bees were pollinators, and you know, not having an appreciation for kind of that dependency of some of those crops on pollinators, but also people kind of attempting to, you know, they maybe, some people really didn't like the kind of quantification of like the produce. Again, they were like, that's not why I grow my own food, I do it for the pleasure. And so they one person was particularly offended by it, but you know, some people were like, oh, it's kind of not the whole picture, which, you know, we're aware of, but we were kind of, you know, I think especially when we kind of published this yield data, it got a lot of attention because there just really isn't that much data around crop yields. But yeah, lots of people had lots of different opinions on kind of what's important in an urban growing context. And I have some of that data that I'm trying to go through, but I'm not a social scientist. So I wouldn't say I collected it in the most rigorous way. We just had kind of these roundtable conversations. And yeah, I'd be really keen to work with someone in the social sciences more to kind of collect that data around those non-productivity benefits of growing, particularly as the cost of living crisis and everything is kind of shifting those costs and benefits as well.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah.
I remember reading last year that urban farms, particularly in the UK, have a much higher soil organic content than like traditionally farmed places at the moment, just because of the obviously soil quality is degrading. But it makes me think about how people are doing the fertilization in let's say urban farms in the UK versus like in Calcutta. Is there any data to show that people are using more like animal waste products on the farms in the cities there?
Yeah, I was actually talking.
It's really dirty here. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I think people still use manure a lot though here, like horse manure that's rotted down. But yeah, I was talking to my master's student actually about this, about kind of use of cow dung in kind of fertilization, but also pest control as well. So some of the farmers that we spoke to around Calcutta were using some really interesting kind of organic pest deterrents. But yeah, in hindsight, I really wish I had collected data on fertilizers.
Like that is one positive aspect of like animal keeping for agriculture, is that obviously not all of the inputs and outputs of the animal are actually bad for the environment.
Yeah, and I guess you're probably familiar with some of Chris Sandham's work around, you know, I think he worked with Tablehurst, which is a biodynamic farm where the idea is to have like this closed loop system where, you know, you have the animals who use the dung, you kind of, you know, you're not taking any nutrients out or putting any kind of external nutrients in. So.
I assume that's often the case, that there's less soil being exposed to the atmosphere in these smaller places, because you only bring up enough potatoes that you need right now, and therefore that's going to reduce the actual weathering of carbon into the atmosphere.
Yeah, so that's why we're really interested in looking at perennial crops, so fruit trees and bushes, and you know, they're also really good for biodiversity because they provide that kind of heterogeneity, and those kind of, you know, hedgerows, as we know, are kind of amazing for biodiversity, and I think they could be, you know, and orchards and things are also a great recreational space. I mean, the one thing about allotments is that they're great for the people who have an allotment, but the rest of the kind of, you know, okay, you can see the green space, but it's quite hard for the wider community to interact with them. So it'd be nice to have more growing spaces that are kind of more community based. Yeah,
I just quickly wanted to add, so a number of years ago, took me 7 years to get an allotment for our town that I live in. We had 25 families on there. And just going to a point the chap said there, the vast majority didn't do it because it's cheaper to buy. It was for the whole pleasure of actually gardening themselves and growing and having their children there and showing them that sort of thing. And also, secondly, the vast majority of the compost that we get in is manure. So it's either going to be
that's good.
cow.
Yeah.
Occasionally we get compost, which is mushroom. Spent mushroom compost, but mostly it's manure.
Oh, that's really good. Yeah, I didn't look at these other inputs, I think, but yeah, other people are doing that, which is good. Thanks, Karen.
Great. I think we've got 5 minutes, but then people need to break.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
SSRP. So
Yeah.
join me to thank Beth for the great talk.
I'm going to let you do the technology. Stop sharing.